Okay, second period. This is what we're going to be covering today. Hopefully I will see you tomorrow. If not, I'll post that as well. So make sure as you're looking at this that you are taking notes from your notes. So yesterday, this is where we ended up. These are some facts on Dwight D. Eisenhower. And remember, as you're going through this, you can stop if you need to take some notes, but I'm going to go rather quickly. So after Korea, Vietnam is our next major conflict. And prior to World War II, Vietnam had been a French colony. During World War II, Japan had come in, occupied, basically raped the country, took their rice supplies, were very oppressive to the Vietnamese people. And Ho Chi Minh, who is a nationalist, a very interesting guy, was fighting. He was fighting the French, trying to get his country to be Vietnamese. Then, during World War II, he was actually an ally of the United States. We supplied him with weapons, and he fought the Japanese. After the war, he was hoping that we would back him up because of his contributions during World War II, and we did not. He actually even wrote a Declaration of Independence, very similar to the U.S. Declaration, but Truman ignored that, and we backed France. So Ho Chi Minh is going to go to war against the French, and ultimately he will defeat them.
The siege of the French military base at Dien Bien Phu by communist forces began on November 20th, 1953. The base was surrounded by 2 divisions of Viet Minh forces. The French Air Force brought in supplies to the 15,000 defenders until the airbase was captured by the enemy on March 27th, 1954. Airdrops became ineffective and costly. 62 French aircraft were shot down and another 107 damaged. One by one, defensive positions around the Dien Bien Phu perimeter fell to the Viet Minh. A final enemy assault was launched on May 7th, and the starving defenders, using the last of their ammunition, were overrun. By then, about 5,000 French soldiers had been killed during the siege. Of the remaining 10,000, about half of them wounded. All but 73 were captured. The Viet Minh had finally won, but at a cost of about 25,000 casualties. The fall of Dien Bien Phu virtually ended French control over Indochina.
This is Indochina today. No longer is the fighting there a mere skirmish with terrorists, it is war. French paratroops drop into Dien Bien Phu, the very center of the conflict. The situation at this fortress camp clearly indicates how the pattern of the fighting has changed. American planes, guns, and ammunition are helping the French and Vietnam forces. Russian and Chinese weapons are aiding the Viet Minh. Thus, the clash is between East and West, and the prize is no longer just Indochina, but all Southeast Asia. In Dien Bien Phu, the biggest battle of the war is on. 4 of the communists' 7 regular divisions hammer the French defenders by day and night. Colonel de Castries, the French garrison commander, has ordered his men to die rather than retreat.
So the battle at Dien Bien Phu is a disaster for the French. It lasts 55 days. The Viet Minh are able to surround them, and the French are going to have to surrender. They go to Geneva, and they decide to divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh troops will have the north, and the United States is going to sponsor a Democrat Vietnam in the south. So this is the 17th parallel, and Ho Chi Minh is not real happy about this, although the terms are supposed to be, after a period of time, there's supposed to be an election, and let the people decide whether they want to be one country or not, and we never did allow that. President Eisenhower, in the meantime, remember we had the Truman Doctrine. Now we're going to have the Eisenhower Doctrine. And the Eisenhower Doctrine basically says that anytime that it looks like a communist country is trying to use aggression to control another country, we will meet that aggression with aggression. So it's basically a show of force. That's what it means. We will meet aggression with aggression, including nuclear weapons if necessary. This is called massive retaliation, and we are going to build up military arms, and the slogan was more bang for your buck. So we're building up our nuclear arsenal, but we're also building up troops and other arms. So going to other areas of the world, we have Israel. And of course Israel, holy ancient land that is home to the beginnings of many religions. Zionism is a belief that the Holy Land, the homeland, that one day God will allow Jews to return to Palestine. And diaspora, that is Jews who have been exiled or displaced return home. So in May of 1948, the state of Israel, which had been basically controlled by Britain, is created. And it's a brand new country, and the United States is the first to recognize Israel. Middle Eastern countries are not thrilled with this, and there is still tension to this day.
For centuries, the land now known as Israel has been home to both Palestinians and Jews. But for more than 50 years, this small nation has also given rise to bloody wars, refugees, and terrorism. Two peoples, both with a claim to this land, both turning to violence when diplomacy fails. What are the roots of this conflict, and can there be peace in this divided land? Israel, Palestine. This is the birthplace of Christianity, Judaism, and also sacred to Muslims. Its holy sites are places of pilgrimage for millions. The Jews trace their history here to the time of the Bible, when God promised the land to Abraham. But the Palestinians are also descended from the ancient biblical peoples and from the Arab conquerors of the 7th century. But for the Jews, expelled from this land over the centuries by invaders, its spiritual legacy is one they've never relinquished. Jews are persecuted for centuries in Europe, The pogroms, or massacres, of the late 19th century lead many to believe they will only be safe in their own state. This belief becomes a political movement called Zionism. Then, the biggest war the world has ever seen, the First World War in 1914, means that the Jews are to come closer to a homeland. The British want allies in the Middle East. The Arabs are fighting the Turkish Ottomans for independence, and the British back them. British ally Russia is losing the will to continue, and believing the Jews could influence the Russians, the British back Jewish claims for a homeland. After the war, the Germans are defeated. The Middle East is divided between the British and the French. Palestine is now governed by Britain. Their fateful decision in 1919 to adopt the Jewish claim for a homeland as official policy is to affect the Holy Land from that moment on.
The British mandate was designed specifically to bring about the creation of a national home for the Jews, which ultimately meant a state, with no similar commitment to self-government or independence or statehood for the indigenous inhabitants, in other words, the Palestinian Arabs.
Encouraged by the attitude of the British, 35,000 Jews emigrate to Palestine over the next 4 years. Palestinian unease about the influx leads to riots against the Jews and the British, culminating in the 3-year Arab Revolt of 1936. The Palestinians are crushed by the British and their leadership destroyed. The Jews continue to arrive, although the British start limiting numbers. The end of the Second World War makes the question of a recognized homeland a priority. 6 million Jews are exterminated in the Nazi death camps during the Holocaust, and the survivors are determined that it will never happen again. With no safe haven in Europe, because countries turn them away, they look to the land of Palestine, a land the Jewish Bible, the Torah, calls Israel. But the Palestinian Arabs don't want any more Jews immigrating, and to keep the peace, the British limit the influx, turning boatloads away. The UN decide that Palestine should be divided into separate Jewish and Arab states. The Palestinian Arabs are allocated sections to the northwest, in the center, a strip by the sea, and land on the Egyptian border. The Zionists are given what remains, while Jerusalem is to be controlled by the UN. But the Palestinians reject the plan. But as Israelis celebrate, they're plunged into war. They have to defend themselves against 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, who launch an attack. They're opposed to the creation of Israel and want to secure land for Arabs. To the world's astonishment, Israel wins its war of independence, and its victor claims some of the territory designated to Palestine. But neighboring Jordan seizes the West Bank, and more land is lost to Egypt, which claims the Gaza Strip. Jerusalem is split in 2, Israel controlling the west of the city and Jordan the east. In 1956, a crisis erupts over the Suez Canal, a vital shortcut for ships traveling to Europe from the rest of the world. Britain and France are major shareholders, and when Egypt nationalizes the canal, they promise to give more aid to Israel if she backs them. So Israel goes to war against Egypt. A ceasefire is agreed, but there would be no lasting peace between Arab and Jew, while Palestinians remain stateless. For the next 20 years, Arab countries oppose the State of Israel. Then comes the Six-Day War.
6 Days War was a defining moment in the history of Israel. You know, since the War of Independence, 19 years, there was no major challenge to the existence of Israel. Here it comes once again.
Israel turns to the United States for support.
When the moment of truth came, the American commitment evaporated. And we realized once again that we have to rely only on ourselves. It was not easy. There was a lot of hesitation and anxiety in the political leadership.
Britain and France also refuse help. And again, Israel fights alone. But in 12 hours, they completely destroy the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces, and within 6 days, wipe out their armies. Israel now has defense in depth. She creates buffer zones between herself and her enemies. She takes the West Bank from Jordan, the Gaza Strip and the Sinai from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria, and quadruples in size. With shifting borders, 1 million more Palestinians come under Israeli military rule. Trying to bring about peace, the UN passes a resolution, which is to become the basis of all future negotiations. Resolution 242 states that land now occupied by Israel will be exchanged for peace if the Arabs recognize Israel's existence. But Israel won't withdraw, and most Arab nations refuse to recognize the Jewish state.
So you can see here by this map, Israel is very small, and it is surrounded by nations that would like to see them gone. One of the organizations is called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. And the longtime leader of this organization was a guy named Yasser Arafat. And basically, they want their homeland back. And this is fighting that is still going on to this day. Mahmoud Abbas is the current leader of the PLO. And we've had so much controversy now with the Ukraine and with Syria that sometimes the controversy between the Palestinians and Israel kind of hits the last page of the paper, but this is still going on to this day.
And the Palestine Liberation Organization, a militant force committed to regaining its homeland, was born. In 1970, tensions escalate when Jordan expels the strong PLO from its borders. Thousands of PLO soldiers settle in camps in southern Lebanon, camps dedicated to training future Palestinian guerrillas. Lebanon was the last possible refuge for the PLO. While the cosmopolitan capital of Beirut was called the Paris of the Mideast, Lebanon had a weak army and was governed by a fragile coalition of Christians and Muslims. The harmony crumbled when the PLO began attacking Christian villages in the mid-70s. Civil war broke out between the PLO, backed by Syria, and various Christian militias, backed and financed by Israel.
We are facing one enemy, and we have to get rid of this enemy. There is no way to negotiate with this enemy. The only way is to finish with him. Bravo.
The leader of the PLO is Yasser Arafat.
We are the victims, and we are insisting not to be the discards to our enemies.
And the PLO continues to escalate its terrorist activity against Israel.
Okay, so let's go to another country there in the Middle East. This is Mohammad Mossadegh, and he's the leader of Iran. And remember, we talked about the CIA, how we are spending millions and millions of dollars to build up the CIA at this point. And basically, when Mohammad Mossadegh took control, he wanted to nationalize the oil fields, give them back to the people. Well, we had BP there, we had Shell, we had American companies, and monetarily, we thought it would be in the best interest of our country to have a leader who was sympathetic to those oil interests. So with the help of the CIA, Mohammad Mossadegh is going to be ousted from power. If you want to know a little bit more about that, he uses 2 links, and it talks about the CIA involvement in Iran. Through these mechanizations, a new leader is going to take power, and this is the Shah of Iran. And he is sympathetic to the United States. He is an ally of the United States. He is not a strict Muslim. And basically, he's going to be a very harsh ruler, though, over the people of Iran. In Egypt, the leader there was a man named Abdel Nasser, and he wanted to nationalize the Suez Canal. Suez Canal, remember, had been around for a while. It was one of the first major canals, and they are going to go to war over this nationalization of the Suez Canal. It almost came to a World War III. Suez Canal is important, especially as oil became more and more important, to get those ships through and deliver this energy production to the rest of the world. We had promised to help with a dam and hydroelectric power, and basically Nasser got angry with the United States when we didn't back him 100%, and he's going to go over to the Russians, and the Russians are going to help him with the building of this dam. They're also not happy with us because we are backing Israel at this point.
Britain rushes troops into the latest trouble zone of the Near East as infantry units debark at Faid in the Suez Canal zone. At Ismaili, tension reaches its peak. The Egyptian government vows to oust the British from control of the canal and from the Sudan. Egyptian workers are gradually withdrawn from the area as the conflict takes on the aspects of a holy war, and troops take over the task of unloading vital supplies in an area in which Britons are now practically marooned. The strictest supervision is imposed on all travel through the canal zone, as clashes with Egyptians have mounted. As the situation gains in intensity, the zone is placed under virtual martial law, with Muslims inciting the natives and Britain holding to the rights granted under the Treaty of 1936, which permits it to control the vital route to the Far East. Here in the restless Near East are the seeds of war, and troops constantly on the move give evidence that Britain will fight grimly to guard the traditional lifeline that has maintained a shortcut to India for the empire's shipping.
Okay, so if we go to South America, Guatemala in 1954, here comes the CIA again, and we're going to send the CIA in to topple a potential communist takeover. The United Fruit Company had been there for, about 50 years at this point, and this United States-owned company owned 42% of the land. So, of course, the people want their country back, and there is this rebellion, and the CIA is going to come in and basically put down this rebellion of the people. And, you know, we're going to talk a lot about this in the upcoming month or so about all the CIA involvement during the 50s and the 60s. Okay, this is Guatemala. Okay, what's going on in Cuba? So ever since 1898, we had basically control, if you remember that Platt Amendment, we had control of what was going on over in Cuba. And this was the pro-American leader, a guy named Fulgencio Batista. And my goodness, the mafia had casinos in Cuba, U.S. capitalistic interest abounded. This guy would take payoffs, and the Cuban people, for the most part, were very poor. Lots of folks, it was kind of like the Las Vegas of the East Coast. Lots of people would go to Cuba for gambling. So this man organizes a rebellion, Fidel Castro, and basically has the people behind him. And he is going to be successful in ousting Batista and taking over Cuba.
Summer 1958. Losing his control of Cuba to an increasingly popular revolutionary movement, dictator Fulgencio Batista must take a decisive step to stop the threat to his regime. He calls his action Operation Verano.
By June of 1958, the rebels were firmly entrenched in the Sierra Maestra. Batista finally decided the time had come to launch a full-scale offensive against those rebel positions, convinced that he could indeed drive them out of the mountains.
Batista assures his supporters that before the summer is out, the revolution will be no more.
Batista plans to send in 12,000 professional troops to fight the guerrilla in Oriente, and it's really going to be the first major encounter that these guerrillas have had with any sizable force. On the one hand, you have 12,000 troops on Batista's side, facing only 300 guerrilla. But those 12,000 troops were largely unseasoned, and they were pretty much terrified of Fidel's forces.
Spies, scouts, and runners bring Castro the news. The army is coming, 12,000 strong. Although outnumbered, the rebels are confident they are not outmatched.
Castro has the advantages of guerrilla warfare. He's got the support of the local population. He knows this terrain. And so when Batista sends his troops there, Castro is fighting in his own backyard.
The guerrillas had developed a system of using loudspeakers in the jungle, and in some cases they would surround Batista's forces with the loudspeakers and blast music, jingles, songs at them. This would completely freak the soldiers out because they would just hear this music coming from what seemed like everywhere around them.
The rebels had prepared the terrain in the Sierra Maestra. They had planted mines in the pass leading into the mountain. They were waiting for the offensive.
At the Estrada Palma sugar mill, Castro's fighters anxiously await the major offensive from Batista's forces they know and dread is about to explode. When government troops arrive, the rebel ambush is ready. The attack hands Batista's men a devastating defeat, and as the assault spread across the mountains, his troops proved to be unprepared for this type of combat. In desperation, Batista calls for a flanking maneuver, an amphibious landing south of Castro's main camp. The rebel intelligence network is so advanced that Castro learns when and where Batista will land. He prepares two 50 caliber machine gun emplacements and aims them at the beach.
Given the number of troops that Batista put into the field, they should have been able to wipe out the rebel army. But they were not winning the war. They suffered heavy casualties. The morale of their units went down, while the morale of the rebel forces just increased.
The army doesn't want to fight for him, so finally Batista has to pull them out. And once he does that, that opens up the entire island to Castro.
The embarrassing failure of Operation Verano deals a serious blow to the dictator, and he's fast running out of friends.
It becomes clearer and clearer in the summer of 1958 that Batista can no longer control Cuba, and the U.S. and foreign investors start to abandon him.
Having repulsed the summer offensive, Castro decides that he's strong enough now to launch a counteroffensive. So he sends two of his columns across the island, essentially cutting the island in two.
With Batista's forces retreating to their strongholds, Castro orders his men forward. This begins a dangerous open-ground military offensive against the dictator, a dagger thrust aimed straight for Havana. Civil war engulfs the country. As they celebrate Castro's triumphant charge, they have no way of knowing that he, like Batista, will one day turn his back on democracy and become the very thing he fought to depose, dictator of Cuba.
So when Stalin dies in 1953, the new leader who's going to take over is a guy named Nikita Khrushchev. And Nikita Khrushchev, he's a short little guy with a very, very hot temper. We've talked about this in Today in Histories. So in 1959, we are 58. We've started this spying program, and the U-2 is a plane that is a spy plane, and it flies very, very, very high. And so Francis Gary Powers is the pilot, and he's taking pictures in Russia, and it is shot down. Now, we think that the pilot's dead. We think he's been able to destroy the plane, and we are outraged. We say it was a weather plane. We tell all sorts of lies that obviously it was not a spy plane. We lie, and then Russia says, wait a minute, we got the plane and we got the pilot. So we're caught in a lie, and we are caught spying as well. And when this happens, things that are already tense get even tenser.
By this time, the U-2 had revealed that the Soviets were greatly exaggerating their nuclear capabilities. Seeing continued surveillance as a diplomatic risk, Eisenhower had suspended the flights. But under pressure from his advisors, he reluctantly agreed to allow one more mission.
Mayday in Moscow. This year's parade through Red Square is a 3.5-hour affair with emphasis on peaceful coexistence.
On May 1st, 1960, as Kremlin leaders waved to the May Day crowds in Red Square, a U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over Soviet airspace. In an instant, the plane, the pilot, and any chance for peaceful coexistence came crashing to Earth. The White House had devised a cover plan for just such an occurrence. They claimed the U-2 was on a weather mission originating in Turkey for NASA and had strayed off course. The next day, they changed the story. The plane was piloted by a civilian, and the failure in oxygen equipment had resulted in the pilot losing consciousness and accidentally violating Soviet airspace. It was all rubbish. Khrushchev knew the U.S. had been flying spy missions over the Soviet Union, and now he had the evidence to prove it. The wreckage of the U-2 and the American pilot, alive and kicking. Trapped, Eisenhower finally came clean with the American public.
Now, this does not put the United States on trial whatsoever.
At the Paris summit 2 weeks later, Khrushchev turned the U-2 incident into a crisis.
Khrushchev outdoes his earlier outburst against President Eisenhower at the commencement of the Paris meeting. Flanked by Foreign Minister Gromyko and glowering Marshal Malinowski, he fires a barrage of threats, insults, and menaces, warns of devastating blows at bases used by American espionage planes, denounces American acts of aggression, and in general follows a tough line that seems to signal a new freezing spell in the Cold War.
The captured U-2 pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was convicted of espionage against the Soviet Union and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was August 17, 1960. That very same day, in the skies over the Pacific Ocean, an Air Force pilot snatched a falling capsule from midair. The event marked a breakthrough in the top-secret project to develop Corona, the world's first Earth-orbiting reconnaissance satellite. The U-2 may have been downed, but America had a new eye in the sky, and this one could capture stunningly clear and revealing images of its target from more than 100 miles in outer space.
So, that kind of takes us up to 1960. Tensions are rising, and let's go back and we'll see what's happening domestically.